Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this third weekly panel, which is an update on the Ukraine war. And in the past 2 weeks, we've had a number of esteemed colleagues from Marshall University talking to us about their perspectives, their analyses, their experiences as well in Ukraine, Russia, and in Europe in general, and their understanding about this crisis. And today, we wanted to bring in some people from Ohio and Kentucky as sort of a tri-state effort to bring everybody together and talk about this from a historical perspective, as well as looking at the current events. And of course, today is an important day because for a number of reasons, but one is that it's been 8 years. This is the 8th anniversary today of the Russian annexation of the Crimea, and that's essential towards understanding what's going on in Ukraine today as well. That was a flashpoint, and the events leading up to March 18, 2014 were just as important as the events that have happened since then too. So our guests today, I don't see Karen. Karen Patron, are you there? I can't see you. Okay.
She said she might be late because she's stuck in traffic.
Oh, I understand. Okay, thank you, Dr. Miner. So our first guest today is Stephen Miner, Dr. Stephen Miner, who's been at Ohio University for 37 years, and he's a professor in the Department of History there, and he's a specialist in recent Russian and Soviet and Eastern European history. I had the pleasure of talking to him a week and a half ago about the historical perspective of this, or historical context of this crisis. And our other guest is Dr. Karen Patron, who is a professor of history at the University of Kentucky. So we have Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia represented here today. Also with us from Marshall University in the Department of Biological Sciences, we have Victor Fett, who is Ukrainian American. And hi, Karen. There she is. And grew up in Russia for the most part, but also traveled quite a bit to Ukraine, and he has a great level of experience as well. Karen, I just mentioned who you were, history professor at the University of Kentucky. I had a great conversation with Dr. Patron a couple weeks ago as well about the historical context of the Ukraine war here today. Also with us is Dr. Anara Tabashileva, who is from Kyrgyzstan and has a tremendous amount of experience in this area and research as well. She is my office mate at the history department at Marshall University. We also have another Marshall professor, professor of English, Katerina Shrey, Ukrainian American, and a lot of other people here too, Stefan Schoberlein and Larry Sherritt. I really appreciate everything that everybody's done to bring everybody together today. So what I wanted to do first is to ask Dr. Miner, if you would, can you give us a sense of the historical significance of the March 18th takeover of Crimea that Putin carried out?
The historical significance of the seizure, well, it's fairly recent history. I can tell you historically why they made the case that it was a Russian possession and why it should belong in Russia. But as for its historical effect, that's largely what we'll be talking about later. It came fairly late into the Russian Empire, not until the 1780s. It was acquired by Catherine the Great, and it's rarely been entirely populated by Russians. And I know that when Putin moved in with his little green men in 2014, he held a referendum which claimed, I think, to be about 98% in favor of joining Russia. This doesn't seem very realistic to anybody who has even a passing knowledge of Ukraine, because there's a substantial Ukrainian population there, but also a substantial Tatar population, much of which would not be inclined to vote for Russian control. So the numbers are clearly fake. Even Kim Jong-un gets lower numbers in Korean elections, as far as I can remember. It is popular, however, the seizure with the Russian people, so far as we can tell, because Ukraine was given to Ukraine, Crimea was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev on the anniversary of the treaty that joined Ukraine in 1654 to Russia, or at least part of Ukraine. And it was more of an administrative shift because at that time nobody really believed that the USSR would disintegrate and that somehow this would go with an independent Ukraine, even though the Soviet constitution said that its republics had the right to secession. Nobody believed that would ever be exercised. And so allowing Ukraine to control Crimea or have it be part of the republic was simply an administrative rearrangement. However, that doesn't mean it's not popular, as I said, with the Russian public. It does, of course, secure Sevastopol and the coast of Crimea for the Russian Navy. It's also a marvelous place to visit. I've been there. It's like going to the French Riviera, although unspoiled. So it's actually a beautiful place, and it's been the playground of wealthy Russians for a good long time. And it certainly gave Putin a fillip. So in those, that's, I think, kind of the historical background. As to its effect, I'm afraid to say that our reaction, the Western reaction to the incorporation of Crimea into Russia, was terribly weak-kneed, and I think helped give Putin the impression that he could push farther without any fear of counter-pushing. The sanctions that were passed against Putin and his regime were really very weak, and they were directed at a few individuals, but they didn't hit Russia where it really hurt in terms of banking or in terms of energy. Not only that, but in a way, Russia was rewarded because the Nord Stream pipeline went ahead after the acquisition of Crimea. That is, Germany agreed to increase its dependency on Russian gas and energy after Crimea had actually been forcibly incorporated into Russia. And now Russia supplies 55% of Germany's gas and about 30% of its energy. And so this actually probably helped Putin believe that he could do this sort of thing and that he would not get pushback. And I think it helped to lead what I think is a tremendous miscalculation on his part. I think he expected very different results and much quicker results. And I think he may have bet the farm on a bad bet. And this could harm Russia for a very long time to come.
Thank you so much. And from Dr. Patron's perspective, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I guess I would just go back even a little further to say that there was a series of things that Russia engaged in the war with Georgia in 2008. That's even before the Crimea, and then of course the annexation of the two areas in eastern Ukraine, right after the taking of Crimea. And I think that the problem has been that the response now is all out, but the response then was not as well as it was not calibrated to actually deter Putin from taking the next steps. So I do think that there has been a problem with the response making it clear that there is a red line. I'm sorry, I'm hearing an echo.
I am too.
So I know. So I agree that the West perhaps could have responded, or sort of responded to Putin sooner with more intensity.
I would agree with that, and I'd add that there are other adventures that Putin has been involved in. He also has troops in Transnistria, and of course in Syria and in Libya. And at each point, he hasn't been met with anything other than mush. And so he's gotten the impression that he can do these things at a very low cost. And I think it must have surprised the heck out of him, the reaction he got. But what stroke of genius does it have to be for a leader of Russia to bring about the rearmament of a relatively pacifist Germany? This was a tremendous miscalculation on the part of Putin. And Russia will pay for it for quite a while.
Agreed. And of course, there are many things that are happening on a daily basis, even, that are changing the situation or adding to the situation on the ground. And so that's why we wanted to do these weekly updates. We had spring break this week, and we thought, well, maybe we should wait until next week and everybody's back. But as some people pointed out in the group, things are happening way too fast to delay this. Victor, did you want to add anything?
Was that directed to me? Were you asking me if I wanted to add anything?
Well, I was asking Victor.
Okay.
Well, I could add for a couple of hours. I could talk, but as a person who has spent summers there on the Black Sea with my parents, including Crimea, Anara had the same experience. All of us growing up in Soviet Union thought Crimea, the warm sea coming from frozen reaches of Siberia, is a wonderful place. It's a paradise. It had the best children's camp for elite children of the elite in the Soviet Union. So it's not surprising that in the psyche of post-Soviet Russia, Crimea was always this type of paradise. It's extremely infantile culture, what you see in the declining Russian Empire right now. And as such, it grabbed at Crimea as this last piece of paradise. You have seen maybe these hysterical crowds in Crimea, all across Russia. It helped to boost failing image of Putin after, I would say, a failure in Georgia, because in 2008, whatever weak response of the West was, Georgia has not fallen. And at this time, of course, resistance of Georgians, a small nation, could not have been as we see now. Ukraine is fighting as the world has not seen, at least in modern history. I'm trying to search my memory for analogies, but nothing since ancient Greece comes to my mind.
And Dr. Miner, I'm curious, can you think of something, some kind of a big blind spot that's happening in the U.S. media right now? What are they not, how are they failing to deliver the correct context or framework for understanding what's happening over there?
That's a broad question. I don't think that the coverage of Ukraine in the Western media, the American and the British media in particular, is uniform or uniformly good. There's a lack of understanding about the forces that are unleashed by this war. There's a lack of historical context, and a lot of the reasoning is simplistic. And as a result, you have very different views ranging from left to right. Some of the left and the right actually converge in seeing Ukraine as a country that's unworthy of being saved, or that it's a Nazi regime, or various other things. They bought into some of these arguments. And particularly the whole nationalist and Nazi narrative, which you do hear raised occasionally in major media. People don't know who the Bonderites were, and nor do they know who the Vlassovites were either. They don't understand that collaboration with the German invader didn't just happen in Ukraine. It happened in Russia as well, and also that it's 80 years ago, and that things have changed. And even though the news occasionally does remind people that Zelensky is himself Jewish and that his father was a decorated war hero, there's somehow this sense that the Ukrainian government, on the part of a lot of people, the Ukrainian government is somehow tainted with the Azov Brigade and the history of the OUN. And I think it should be pointed out more times than people do that there are more ardent nationalists in the German parliament than there are in the Ukrainian Rada right now. That doesn't mean that there aren't nationalists. It doesn't mean that they aren't, some of them, pretty nasty people. And Bondera's legacy is not a happy one. But it's a very small slice of the Ukrainian reality, and it gets far too much play. And some of the very serious pathologies that have taken root in Russia aren't really highlighted because people just don't know them. And I think I said when we talked, what I'm afraid of is this, that there's a sort of dynamic in the Western coverage of events. People get very hot over something when it first happens, and everybody's sympathetic to the Ukrainians. People then get compassion fatigue after a few months pass. And what I particularly worry about is Putin has been successful in shutting down the domestic press and expelling the foreign press. While the Western press can operate and does operate in Ukraine, war is a horrible thing. And even the good side, even the better side, I should say, does horrible things. There will be war crimes, and some of these will be on film. But they'll only be on film in Ukraine because Russia will be exempt from that. You'll see the effects of it, but you won't necessarily see Russians committing war crimes. And I think there's a dynamic at work that over a long period of time, people who aren't particularly well informed about what's going on will become indifferent to the survival of the Ukrainian state, which I think is crucial. I think the survival of Ukraine against this onslaught is actually crucial to Western democracy and to the European order, the post-war European order. I don't know if that answered. Don't know if that answered your question.
Definitely, and I think that's something that people really don't understand, that Putin's rise is actually in part as a result of NTV and the Russian media in general kind of helping him along, and he was very cognizant of how to frame his legacy as well as the history and the future in order to through the media and which these speeches that he's given too.
Can I add one thing to that? He's very clever at the way he uses history, and he's used history quite a bit. He's written 2 very long essays on history, and then his declaration of war or special military operations was itself a historical document. It used history to make his point. But he's very careful the way he uses history, and he's really very good at throwing out accusations that besmirch another side and somehow make its sins seem equivalent to a far worse side. For example, he's blamed Poland for the outbreak of the Second World War because Poland helped in the division of Czechoslovakia at the Munich Agreement. It took Teschen, it took a part of Czechoslovakia. Well, who are the Poles then to complain about the division of Poland between the Nazis and the Soviets? And he does that all the time. It's sort of a postmodern attack on rationality and on understanding of history, where you throw a whole bunch of stuff at the wall, some of it will stick, and what it does is it takes the ignorant populace, the people who are ignorant because they have to be, they're not well informed about international affairs, and they say, it's just a mess. And you're going to get, those people have been fighting for hundreds of years over there. You're going to get that argument, which is, I think, a very pernicious argument. But it works. Putin plays on that very well.
Karen,
yeah,
Karen, we spoke about this too. Yeah, please.
So a couple of things. One is that the Putin has been very successful in creating this muddied water, right? That's part of what he does, and a lot of what we saw in the 2016 elections and the Russian bots and all of this sort of stuff. It's the same thing. Just create enough of a doubt. Create an alternative version, enough of a doubt, people start to get confused, and then you have a few useful idiots who pick up the sort of the incorrect line and start promoting it. And I think that this is where this has been his forte in for the last decade or so, in trying to sort of besmirch the West and trying to rile things up in Brexit and the American elections. And here, I think Professor Miner is absolutely right that war is a difficult thing, and the Ukrainians are not going to do 100% of the things right, and they're going to take that one thing that looks a little off and use it as a wedge and use it to create a kind of, well, maybe there are, I believe a famous quote of, there are good people on both sides kind of thing, right? Which here, clearly this is Russian aggression. There is there's no really other interpretation, but I think that they're very good at creating confusion and other interpretations where really there's only one interpretation that exists.
If I may, I might also add, I'm watching Russian news daily, both expat on our side and from Moscow. And we can see very much increasing, very shrewd, very sleek propaganda. They're making websites like Fakes About War, modeled after American similar sites. And it's not easy, even for intellectuals, to make their way through it, especially for Western intellectuals who are used more or less to detecting some truth among statements. Complete blatant lie by tons is not something which you can even bear in our sensory overloaded culture. Your brain doesn't work in this environment. It's complete onslaught. It should not be underestimated. We should teach our students that what they have as fake news is now thousandfold propagated in English and, of course, in Russian. So it's a very different world. Since 3 weeks ago, I guess historians might correct me, but I think we are living through there are many points of no return, but we are living through, as we say in natural science, phase change. It is liquid to solid, plasma to gas. That's what happens right now with the world and its current history. And Ukrainians are just fighting for upfront. The closest analogy which came to me in the last 3 weeks is Lord of the Rings. Plain and simple. Gates of Mordor opened and all the free races are united against orcs. And here I need to say something. American public doesn't see this yet, how demoralized and uneducated are Russian troops. How they were sent to kill people indiscriminately, how they were zombified, not to be humane. We do not see that because most of it comes out only now, and people on all sides are genuinely surprised that people fighting for Putin are not fighting for any ideology or idea. It's not even Stalin's Russia. These young boys, whom everyone pities, do not pity anyone. They're worse than Nazis. I say this as a Jewish person whose half of family was killed by the Nazis in the same places which are now bombed by Putin's troops.
And that actually brings us to a point that Dr. Miner and I were talking about in our conversation a couple weeks ago about how the Russian military is quite inadequate and not up to the task, possibly. You want to talk about some of that?
About the military, well, I think the military has shown itself not to be up to the task. I think it's a hollowed out shell to some degree. I think even that surprised Putin, that they spent an awful lot of money modernizing the Russian army after the collapse of the Cold War. If you remember, immediately after the Cold War, there were photographs of the Kola Peninsula with rusting submarine reactors lying on the ground, broken up airplanes, tanks where the tracks were off. Putin was going to turn this around. He was going to spend a great deal of money on a blue water navy. He was going to build up special forces, which he did, I think. Probably the special forces may work. But a lot of the money flowed into the sands and ended up in villas in the south of France and in yachts in the Mediterranean, and not in the gas tanks of some of these tanks that they bought, and not in the spare parts that those tanks need. And Victor's point about the lack of morale is absolutely on point. But it's a lack of morale not just for the young lads, it's also for the officers. Who wants to die for Putin? Who wants to fight for Putin? What is the motivation? As you say, this is not Stalin's Russia. You can make a comparison between the attack on Ukraine with the Winter War of 1939 to 40, in the sense that a much vaunted and tremendously powerful force goes against a much smaller country and has trouble subduing it, although they did subdue the Finns in the end. But at least it had some kind of ethos that motivated a lot of the Russian troops. It's true, we have a lot of letters from Soviet troops that said, "Why am I here in Finland? I don't hate the Finns. What's this all about?" But it's much more hollow today. The Russian army. It has no. In fact, Putin has even complained about this, that Russia lacks a unifying ideology. He's tried to build one around a sort of sanctification of the Second War and the army, and he's tried to build one about Holy Russia and the Orthodox Church, and he's tried to portray himself as a defender of traditional values against the licentiousness of the West. But that clearly hasn't taken root in Russia. I think a lot of Russians are willing to give their side the benefit of the doubt and say our lads are liberators. They're not war criminals. But it won't last, because the difference between the reality and the portrayal on Russian television is so great that it'll come crashing down, and it'll do it quite quickly, I think. Putin has not been able to shut an iron curtain over outside information. It leaks. It leaks at the top. It leaks at the bottom. As for the army, it clearly can't organize resupply. Logistics are the heart of military action, not pointing arrows around and capturing places, but logistics and coordination between arms. There's clearly no coordination between the Air Force, ground troops, infantry, intelligence, armor. Russian tanks have been thrown into combat with no infantry support, and so they're sitting ducks for anti-armor weapons. The sort of basic tactics that even somebody who's not schooled in military affairs can see are ruinous aren't only done but repeated several times, and this has led to quite a substantial death rate already. The Russian army has suffered more deaths than the United States did in all of its Middle Eastern campaigns for 20 years. This is not a successful campaign, and I guess if you're looking at this objectively as a Martian, one piece of comfort for Western powers is this is not a threat to the NATO powers. This army would not be able to stand in a conventional war. Having said that, it has nuclear weapons, and we don't know that Mr. Putin isn't willing to use them.
Yeah,
I think. Oh, go ahead, Karen, please.
Oh, I was gonna throw in, sort of another sort of historical comparison, which is this is happening on a rapid scale. It took the Soviet citizens 5-6 years before Perestroika to realize that their invasion of Afghanistan was not what the government said it was supposed to be, and that was a major force in sort of that was one of the reasons that led to the fall of the Soviet Union, was the failure of that war and the lying about it. Here, it seems like the time frame is going to be very compressed, right? We're already 3 weeks into the war, and I believe that many Russians already do understand that the government is lying to them and that this war is not going the way they say it's going, or even happening for the reason they think it's happening. So I do sort of wonder how long it will be before sort of Russian civil society cracks open. And I for the sake of the Ukrainians, I hope sooner rather than later. But that seems to me to be a real issue here. If people realize the extent to which they're being lied to, what will they do next?
I can tell, if I may, what they do next. Now, today, the most popular search question in Russian internet is how to emigrate from Russia. They're fleeing. I have seen a lot of reports. Families fleeing to all neighboring post-Soviet states, Azerbaijan, Georgia. A family from Siberia just moved to Thailand, of all places. All places which do not need visas. They're fleeing as tourists. A friend in Israel is organizing job places for qualified Russians who are flowing to Israel right now. In fact, there are more of them than people from Ukraine. Israel put some limits on Ukrainian refugees, but not on Russian tourists. So it emasculates the country, and it's different from Stalin's or my times, because then we could not leave. Now it's still possible. So it probably will not be Iron Curtain, but it will be very very weak curtain, which will let kind of one-way filter, will let everyone out who saves their children. They're living with children because boys will be drafted very soon.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, sure.
I guess the only analogy might be 1918, when the intellectuals fled
Yes.
Russia. And what I worry about here is these are the highly trained, urbanized, literate, connected, tech-savvy people who are leaving, and also people who have some resources. And what you're doing is you're taking the stratum away from Russia that is absolutely necessary for a modern economy, and to change Russia from being a commodity economy into a modernized economy.
Will not happen. This will not happen. No.
It's a tragedy for Russia because.
It is, but it's strategy which lasts for 100 years now. Russia lost 100 million people. In this century, it lost people like us. We moved out 33 years ago, not just for economic reasons, but for reasons of ideology. We couldn't live under Soviets. And the first opportunity to live, people just moved out. And of course, the West is not ready to for millions of educated refugees, just like Europe was not in 1918, 1919. But this is what is happening. And it's not just the West. People will move to, as I said, to Asia, to Mongolia of all places, to Azerbaijan, to any place which is now independent and will not allow their children to be drafted. On the contrary, just today I heard that a lot of Gastarbeiters, guest workers in Russia, many of them from Central Asia, who have been given visas, will be drafted on condition of citizenship. And these are not fighters. These are just cannon fodder.
But you're right, it's compounding a tragedy of the 20th century. There's been wave after wave of this that has taken the best and the brightest and flung them away. And, you know, I can, as an American, I can say, thank you. We've benefited greatly from this. And in fact, we should welcome them all because they're highly talented people for the most part. But for Russia itself, this is a long-term and serious tragedy.
Might I add, please, that over the last years, right before the war started, many thousands of Russian intellectuals moved to Ukraine.
Yes.
And they're now making a very front team of fighters and ideologists, and many of them don't even know Ukrainian language. This is something that Americans find very hard to understand, why there are Russians who fight Russians. But remember American Civil War.
Or the Russian Civil War.
Or the Russian Civil War, yes. Yeah. Steve?
Anytime anybody wants to add something, please do so. Anara, do you want to say something?
I just would like to, we compared this war to other stories. I would like to compare this war to the Crimean War in the 19th century, mid-19th century. It's very similar. And what we can see on Russian side that Russian army demonstrated corruption, tremendous weakness, and economy of Russia was very weak. And thanks to this Crimean War, new reforms were initiated. So I hope this might be also a moment when Russians realize that it's time to change something in this society. Secondly, I would like to add regarding migration. In my country, in Kyrgyzstan and in Kazakhstan, we have so many IT people because all hotels are booked, and usually the Russian IT people, mostly IT people, say they have three reasons. First, it is protest. They do not agree with this policy. Secondly, because their agency don't want to pay, to wire money, their salaries to Russia, and they can use banks in Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan, or even Tajikistan. And third, because they fear that they don't know what might be the next. So that's why we can see the mass migration, as Victor mentioned, in all post-Soviet republics right now.
I have a question for Dr. Miner and Dr. Fett. Yesterday, the news showed Putin making a speech saying that there would be that a purge of non-patriots would be good for Russia. Any thoughts on what he might have meant by that? I mean, does that mean exactly what it says, what it sounds like it means? Any thoughts on that? That
he would spit them out of his mouth like a fly.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Well, purge has a particularly sinister meaning, or sinister connotation, I would say, in the context of Russian history. And to some degree, it's already started. He's arrested the deputy head of the security services for corruption and presumably for not informing him what was going to happen in Ukraine very well. And I think the search for scapegoats will be on. And there are several of these oligarchs who do have places in the south of France and in England who have made critical comments about this invasion. And so I expect that their money will be sequestered and that Putin will make a show of arresting several people and sending a shockwave to the rest of these folks. So yeah, I don't think this is anything but sinister. And that whole show that he put on in the arena yesterday was deeply sinister. Most people were not there voluntarily. They were sent there by their work or they were told to be there. And they were cheering a war, which he doesn't even allow to be called a war, but a war against a people that have done nothing to the Russians. And it was deeply creepy, actually.
It was creepy, especially when he said that it would be good for them. That just seemed very creepy is the right word. He said
that we've been more united now than we have been in decades. So yeah. He's again trying to attach himself like a limpet onto the glories of the Second World War. And this isn't anything like the Second World War. If anything, it's like the Second World War with the roles reversed.
Thank you.
It reminds me of Persian wars, but they were too long time ago. What happens, though, also, Katerina, I think you're absolutely right. He means what he says. More than often now, I remember the statement of some old Jewish man who survived Holocaust. He said, "Never underestimate a person who says he wants to kill you."
Yeah.
And for so long, the West was, thinking that the rhetoric of Putin with all his cartoons of rockets hitting Florida is just nonsense of some strange tyrant who flies with cranes and all this. Well, it happens that he is so postmodern that he can do both. And I can talk like this forever, but yes, you're correct. And his speechwriters are very shrewd. Some of them are professional literary people who wrote postmodern novels. They know everything, and they watch everything, and they laugh at Western intellectuals. Make sure of that. Professor Fukuyama now comes up and says history hasn't ended.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I don't believe it this time. I didn't believe it last time, by the way.
He has a sequel now. Yeah.
But the purge, I think. I'm sorry. You go ahead, Karen.
Karen. Yeah.
I was just going to say that one of the things that worries me about the rhetoric is that this deeply anti-Western rhetoric is clearly felt by Putin. I mean, I don't know how much some of it obviously is created by propaganda, but the sort of the core element of the idea of Russia opposed by the West and the West somehow, sort of encroaching on Russia and humiliating Russia, treating Russia badly. I think that is that core element is a truth to Putin, and I think or my sense is that he's not making that up, right? He is feeling it, and that is extraordinarily dangerous.
Not just himself, but I'm afraid millions of his countrymen.
Yes.
As well.
One of the things that I thought would be fruitful, and I think some of you have already hit on this too, is looking at his speeches, the language within his speeches, and especially the fact that he does point to, he crafts his message in a very ingenious way. I shouldn't use that word because Trump does, but it is smart because it can be persuasive to the Russian people. But he also adds in some things that are truthful. For example, he talks about on February 24th, he talked about the U.S. actions in Iraq and in Libya and in Syria. And so he can add in the bending of the truth in there, like the Nazification of Ukraine. And if people don't understand what that is, then they can read something that they do know something about, which is the U.S. interventions in Iraq and other places. And what I was wondering about is, how do we as Americans start to craft a different sort of message that can counter that? Because we have been involved in some actions that they're not the same as what Putin's doing, but they were in the Mearsheimer type of perspective, they were in our interests, and they still led to a lot of reduction of our credibility.
If I can answer that, I think he's played that like a virtuoso plays a fiddle. He some of the things he says are right, and he can point to the various missteps of American foreign policy for the last 30 years and say, you've done it too, you've done this too, you've done this too. Where he overreaches is in the details. The devil's always in the details, and it's very easy to make these kind of sweeping arguments and elide the areas where Russia was complicit in some of these things. The story of Syria, for example, is not one just of somehow the United States coming in and taking a perfectly decent Syrian state and pushing Islamic rebels. It was a much more complex story than that, and the Russians have been involved. They were involved even during the Cold War in supporting Assad Sr., and they were involved in the Cold War supporting Saddam Hussein. Those were all Russian tanks that Saddam Hussein had, and he skips over those things and focuses only on points where he can make the case that somehow the United States is uniquely guilty in the world. And how do you craft a counter narrative? Well, you can't, and that's the problem, because in order to craft a counter to that, you'd have to lower yourself to his point and make a propaganda list rather than say, no, look, the world's a complicated place. The answer to Mr. Putin doing what he's doing is saying, forget what the United States has done. Criticize it as much as you wish. That still doesn't make what he's doing in Ukraine correct or moral or decent or right. And if we're going to constantly say that nobody can say something is wrong because they have sins in their past, at that point, you've achieved the postmodern world. At that point, power speaks, and all that counts is power. And that, of course, is what he's aiming at. That's the genius of his manner of doing business.
Sure, well put. But what about the idea of U.S. foreign policy possibly being, I mean, us having a conversation as a country to realize that we're on shaky footing, even with our own population. We think about how divided we are in the world. We're on shaky footing in part because we've engaged in actions like the ones in Iraq. And I mean, it did lead to the rise of ISIS, and of course doesn't dismiss anything that Putin did too, but without those extra chips that he can point to. I mean, this is exactly what Ramzi Youssef pointed out to in his declaration after he was arrested. This is the kind of thing that bin Laden pointed out to. And I'm not obviously trying to say that that they can't bring those things up, but if we are engaged in actions that lead to the slaughtering of civilians and destabilization in places, and this, I believe, does undermine some of our credibility too.
It certainly does, but you're talking about two somewhat separate things. Should the United States put its house in order? Yes, it should. Should we confront the truth of our past? Yes, of course we should. Should we debate the rights and wrongs of intervention in places like Afghanistan and Iraq? Absolutely, certainly. Does that make invasion of Ukraine, a peaceful country that was no threat to Russia, does that make that in any way okay? Does it make it, well, that's just the way great powers act? At some point, you have to say, no, it's not the way great powers act. And if you're going to make that argument, does that mean you support what the United States did in Iraq? Does it mean you support what the United States did in Afghanistan? If you're going to say that Russia has a Monroe Doctrine no different from the United States, does that mean you would support America invading Mexico, for example? No, of course not. At some point, you have to say history is history, and we can judge it as we will. But that doesn't allow you to go on doing criminal things in the future, because criminal things have been done in the past.
And a lot of that rhetoric, of course, is trolling, right? Yes. It's a purposeful sort of post-truth speech. It's not meant to engage in a debate, but to sort of sow discord. And from a European perspective, he's pretty good at doing that. All of his language says one thing to the old European left and says another thing to the new European right. Right? Mm-hmm. The term denazification, if you take that seriously, then you're speaking to the old European left that still has lingering allegiance to Russia. If you take that as sort of almost a trolling tactic, it's what the far right is doing, right? We're not the Nazis, you're the Nazis, right? So depending on your political persuasion, as long as you're on the fringes, you can. He's speaking to you, not in an earnest, argumentative way, but in a propagandistic, sort of post-truth, postmodern kind of way.
You're right, and I think you read very carefully his declaration of the special military operation, and there are several strands to it, some of which appeal to the left, some of which appeal to the right. The left he appeals to by pointing out the sins of American foreign policy, which are real, and which the left is particularly exercised about, and he points to the extension of NATO and that sort of thing. For the right, he talks about culture war matters and gay rights. And I can show you an image where it's called Ukraine's Choice, which shows the back of the Ukrainian head. And on one side, you have Russia in light, with Alexander Nevsky and Orthodox churches and Cosmonaut and Sputnik. And you have a healthy heterosexual family. And you have a tank from Stalingrad. On the other side, what do you have? You have the EU flag, Hitler, the rainbow flag, two gay men kissing, somebody using drugs. And this is the choice. So he's selling this to an audience that's clearly on the right socially, but he's selling it to everybody all at the same time. And he did this in his declaration of military activities. And he did it last night. You asked about his comments last night. One of the points he said is these people who are living in Europe or in the West because they want their freedom of gender choice. Did you get that? That was he threw that into his comments. He hits on that point all the time because that point hits home with a particular segment of opinion in the right. He knows what he's doing, as you say. His writers know what he's doing.
Right, who knows how much he actually understands this.
I would add on another angle that one cannot help but thinking that that Russia was very emboldened by the Afghanistan debacle, and seeing what Afghan troops did not do or did do, logically continued into what Ukrainians will or will not do. Plus, Ukrainian army didn't fight in Crimea in 2014, so it was clear indication on one side of American weakness, on the other of potential Ukrainian. And everyone agrees that on February 24th, 25th, no one in the world was predicting that Ukrainians will resist. This shows us again how weak our skills are, that maybe even intelligence agencies, as far as I can tell, were not aware of potential Ukrainian resistance. And I don't know what they're doing right now, but they better get their act together, otherwise no more Hollywood movies about James Bond and others.
So I think nobody would have predicted Ukrainians' ability to resist, the capability. I think that was a surprise. I think, though, depending on what part of the country, and I'm much more familiar with Western Ukraine than I am with any other part of Ukraine, I think the desire to fight the Russians, I think that was predictable. I think that part was. What's the surprise is that they haven't been squashed militarily. I think that is amazing and a godsend. And that is hard to predict or anticipate.
Can I say one thing about intelligence? The intelligence got it right and it got it wrong. American intelligence was pretty good about the fact that Putin was coming at Ukraine. And a lot of people poo-pooed that at the time. They got it right. In terms of the Ukrainian ability to resist, I think you're quite right. They got that wrong. But I was teaching a course on the Soviet Union in the Second World War when this whole thing was happening, February 24th. And we were talking about 1941 and Stalin's reading of the warnings that he received, which we have a lot more information about now than we had in the past. And there you have somebody building up on the borders of Ukraine, 200,000 troops, obviously citing medical equipment and supplies and aircraft and ringing the whole country, and then actually moving up into support positions. And people were saying, nah, he won't do it. Even Zelensky didn't believe it. People are so in denial when they think surely somebody can't do something as horrible as this. So I think we ought to be a little kind on people who don't get the future right. I'm busy enough with the past, but the future is really hard to predict. I mean, do we know that Ukraine will continue to hold out? I don't know that. I hope it will. I do know that the Russians were ill prepared for this attack. They have a large army, but they only sent 200,000 people into Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is a little over 100,000, and with volunteers, it's probably 200,000. So you have relative parity in human terms, certainly not in equipment terms. But the Russians actually have to win this war, whereas the Ukrainians only have to avoid losing it, but they have to avoid losing it. The odds are not that great in favor of the Russians in the end, as long as the Ukrainians are kept supplied and continue to fight. But who can tell this? Who can tell whether this is going, whether if Mariupol finally falls, if this will lead to a cascade where Kharkiv and other cities fall, and then the Ukrainians' back is to the wall? How do we know whether Kiev continued to be supplied in a situation where it's 3/4 ringed by Russian troops, or if they start using aircraft against trucks? We just don't know these things. And so I think it's easy to know what's going to happen after it happens.
right? This kind of took everybody by surprise, but it kind of reminds me of Nassim Nicholas Taleb's concept of the black swan too, where these things are kind of predictable in a way, but the way that historical events usually do happen is that they're kind of out of the blue because we're focusing on something else, or we assume that something else is going to happen based on prior experiences. And that's how they take us by surprise and make history changing events. Katerina, could you share the message that you received from Ukraine?
Yes, happily. So we've all received an email from the Ukrainian National Forestry University, which was just absolutely wonderful and uplifting and heartwarming. We are actually in touch with Western Ukraine is home to several prestigious universities, among them the Ukrainian National Forestry University, the Vasil Stefanik Precarpathian National University, and the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. And we are in touch with colleagues in all three places. And most of the updates are predictable things you see on the news and how they're doing in their day-to-day lives. But given that we're in a university setting, I thought I would share a couple updates from what two of the universities are doing. So the colleague I heard from sent me an email, and this is a bad translation on my part into English, but it just kind of shows like the bizarre juxtaposition of the surreal and horrible with the everyday. And so she writes, and we, especially I, are a little downplayed from the events around us, and it is difficult to psychologically get it together and finally start doing something. On Monday, March 21st, our university begins teaching remotely using the Teams platform. I do not know what it will look like because it is already known that many students either in occupied territories have nothing, no internet, no electricity, not even food. So whatever education we're going to be doing is going to be very difficult. There are many students who are now in the Army or in the territorial defense, and of course they also cannot study, but we don't always know who they are. So somehow we will adapt, make individual teaching schedules, ? There has never been a situation like this, so no one knows how it should be. So everybody on this call, many of us are college professors, and we can certainly relate to that. I mean, surely we had the big pivot of 2020 where suddenly teaching remotely through distance learning was such a challenge. I cannot imagine doing it in these circumstances. It's a small detail. It's compared to all the other stuff going on, it's nothing. But it's just interesting, like how our counterparts in a university in Western Ukraine, just her daily thought. The other little bit of an update I have to share is from the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, and I have a video to share with this. It is go ahead and cue that up. The video is in Ukrainian, but it has subtitles, and so it should work okay. So if I did this correctly right now, are you seeing a picture of a priest in an embroidered shirt? Is that right? Can someone tell me if that's true?
Yes, that's what we see.
Perfect. So the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, and I might want to add, my father is on this call. He is Dr. Leo Rudnitsky. He has been instrumental in setting up this university and has taught at it many, many times. So hi, Tata. I'm very glad to see you. The Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv has posted this brief video, and I'm going to share it in a second part of it. But it's really reflective of the efforts of the whole city, where you have hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees who have traveled to Lviv seeking shelter. And just about every home has opened up to take care of people who need a place to stay, some of them for an extended period of time, some of them literally just for a day or two as they head to Poland. And so this particular video just shows a group of orphans who are ultimately headed to Sweden, first to Poland, then to Sweden, where hopefully they will be safe. It's a group of 30 orphans. The same university also has students making camouflage netting so that soldiers can hide under it, and also has students making energy bars to feed the hungry. I'm going to go ahead and play just a little bit of this. I'm not sure if the sound comes through, but the subtitles is what you need. All those mattresses you see in the video, those are all donations that came in from the West. So thank you so, and some of which are from our viewers. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I misspoke about where those things came from. We actually sent them to 2 villages outside of View. I apologize for that. The videos, all the videos posted by this Ukrainian Catholic University, like you've noticed, like the kids are smiling. This is, again, this surreal juxtaposition between the horrors that are happening and somehow people staying human, keeping their humanity. I watched several of their little reports, and in every one you see volunteers, I don't say joyful, but yeah, like joyful in serving others, joyful in being able to, even when they have nothing themselves, to being able to make the world a little bit less horrible for the people around them. So that's what I have. I just have an update on 2 of the 3 universities with whom we are in close contact.
That's great. Thanks so much. And I think it's important for the people over there to know that that we're talking about them and that we're standing with them. And so these, and as I understand it, they've also heard some of our panel discussions. Yes. And things like that here.
Yes, in fact, our the very first panel is making its way actually through various Ukrainian colleagues are forwarding it to other universities. I'm not sure about the second one yet, but I mean they're looking for it. We send it, they pass it on. So that is absolutely true. And the email we received earlier today, it was from someone. It was from a different person than the colleague whose email I read. That was just a huge thank you for seeing what we're suffering. Thank you for being aware of us. Thank you for speaking on our behalves. It's full of lots of love and gratitude, and it's there's very little other than praying, other than sending supplies, other than petitioning our leaders to do something, even though we don't necessarily know what that something is. The next thing we can do is to let people know that they're not alone in their pain. It seems like such a small thing, but it is something that we can do, and it was beautiful to get that email today from the faculty of the Forestry University. That was a beautiful email.
Definitely. Is anybody in the group here aware of Americans that are going over to either fight or assist? Something along the lines of what happened during the Spanish Civil War?
My daughter has applied to, she works for the Clinton Health Initiative, and she's applied for 5 different positions assisting refugees. She also worked for the International Rescue Commission. She's applied for 5 different positions in Poland dealing with refugees. She has not heard back yet. Of course, this is early days, but she will probably get one of those, I hope.
Yeah, I just haven't heard much in the news about this. I've heard little snippets from stories, but that are mentioned every once in a while that have an American that's over there, but it doesn't seem like there's knowledge about mobilization yet.
I know that one of the, I think it was Slovakia, said that because technically it's illegal to fight for another country in another country's army. And I think Slovakia waived that rule, that restriction, a couple weeks ago. I'm not sure if other countries have followed suit, and I can certainly understand why that would be a big decision on the part of a country to do that. But it was interesting to hear that Slovakia had said it's not going to prosecute. I think it was Slovakia.
Same in Latvia and Denmark.
Okay, yeah.
There have been American volunteers. Lavrov said that if they're captured, they will not be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention.
Oh.
What is also interesting was a statement by Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. I think today he said that supplies of weaponry lines of supplies of weaponry to Ukraine will be considered as legitimate military targets for Russia.
Right.
Anyone wants to comment, please?
Dr. Patron, I was wondering if you could give us a sense of the kind of the political divisions as well as kind of the new movements that have been developing in the past 10 years or so in Ukraine.
The political movements. Actually, I might deflect that question a little bit, because one of the questions that I've been pondering, and this, gets at the questions about Russia attacking supplies, is also, what do we think about this no-fly zone? We talked about we talk about not being able to read the future, but is this something that NATO will deeply regret in 5 years' time, that they could have done this and didn't do it, or is this something that we really is this something that is really the right thing to do to limit the war. So that's something that's what Volodymyr Zelensky asked for from Congress. I'm really curious to see what you all think about that. I've been pondering, I don't know the answer. That's the problem. It's a lot easier to write history than it is to write future.
That's actually the big question, right? The big question is, has World War III started, and can we nip it in the bud within the first 4 weeks? Or, and that really is that's what we're kind of struggling with, because looking back, World War II, we didn't know it was World War II until we were into it quite a bit, right? Same thing with World War I. And so that is exactly right, Dr. Petrone. I appreciate that question, and like you, I don't know.
Can I say something about this? That certainly I would like to see an air umbrella over Ukraine. I very much favor the Ukrainian cause, and I think we should do everything we can to defend it. I don't think that if it were to trigger a second world war with a nuclear exchange, anybody's interest would be defended. I don't think that would defend the Ukrainian interests either. The people who talk blithely of a no-fly zone over Ukraine don't think sometimes of the logistics of this. And the logistics are complicated, and they're very important. There are no American air bases that are American controlled that can be used to fly over Ukraine. You'd have to fly out of NATO countries. And in order to do that, you'd have to have the approval of NATO, or you'd fly out, but you couldn't fly back. So that's a first concern. Would Germany, would Poland, would Hungary, I don't even know if we have bases in Hungary, would they allow the operation of American aircraft out of their bases? So that's consideration number two. But consideration number two is more important, which is the Russians. You have S-400 air defense systems, which are apparently quite formidable. And those are stationed in Belarus and in Russia itself, but they have sufficient range to cover Ukraine. And so if you flew combat air patrol over Ukraine, you would be subject to these rocket attacks, these air defense attacks. It's American air doctrine to say you don't go into these areas until you take out the missiles that defend them, because otherwise you're throwing people to the wolves. And you have to ask yourself, are we going to bomb Russia? Has it gotten to that point yet? Because that's what you'd have to do. You'd have to bomb Russia, and you'd have to bomb Belarus. It's not just a matter of flying American airplanes over Kiev and saying, don't fly here. It's a matter of having to actually take on the Russians. And at that point, you might trigger a nuclear exchange. That is a red line Putin has talked about, and it might be one that many Russians would support, for God knows, I don't know. But it's a real risk. And to sort of speak as though this can be done by magic doesn't do anybody any favors. We have to decide whether that's something we want to do. And you rarely hear that talk about, oh, you have to bomb Russia in order to do this. They talk instead, oh, we might shoot down a Russian airplane. That I don't think is the chief consideration.
Dr. Miner, can I ask you a provocative question?
Sure.
What if tomorrow Putin bombs Estonia? What happens then?
Well, that's Article 5.
And
at that point, I think you have to go to war.
Which means?
Which means you bomb them. And at that point, you do take out their missiles. And at that point, you do fly airplanes over Russia. And at that point, you do move into Ukraine and defend Ukraine, I think. Then he's declared war on us if he bombs Estonia. Now, would America do that? I've wondered that for much of my adult life. Would America see New York possibly incinerated in defense of Tallinn? I don't think most Americans would. Would the American government do it? We're pledged by treaty to do it, but we've broken treaties before.
So did Russians.
Well, most people do, but the point is, in this case, it would be a just cause, and I'm not sure that we would. We say we'll honor it, and everyone in NATO has said they'll honor it, every inch of NATO's soil. So either they're going to do what they say and mean what they say, or they're going to live in infamy.
Turkey. What do you both think about Turkey? A NATO country, by the way.
Sure. Karen, I'll give you that.
and then I promise I'll get back to the question about politics in Ukraine over the last 10 years. Sorry about that, Chris. I don't know what I think about Turkey. I mean, Turkey has the opportunity. I mean, Erdogan is not on everybody's favorite list, but I suppose they have a kind of possibility to be a mediator here that could potentially be useful, but I don't know. What were you thinking when you asked the question?
I was thinking about engagement in Syria some time ago when Turks downed Russian airplane. A NATO country, by the way, downing Russian airplane without any consequences we know about. I was thinking about Bayraktars, the Turkish drones. And by the way, about Erdogan's support of Crimean Tatars and Azerbaijan in the recent war, where Putin did not move to protect Armenia, his ally. So Turkey looks like it acts separately from NATO, and I wonder if we will see more of this.
Can I go back to your first question, though, about the no-fly zone? I think there are things you can do short of an actual no-fly zone that would have a similar effect. And there are S-300s that are in the possession of NATO allies in Eastern Europe that are the older model anti-aircraft batteries, Soviet-built, but that the Ukrainians know how to operate, that could be sent in. And we should do that post-haste. I agree with that. I also think, I don't really get the argument about MiGs. I don't know why the MiGs can't be sent into and have Ukrainian pilots. Neither of those things, it seems to me, risk dropping bombs on Russian soil. And I have no problem shooting down Russian planes over Ukraine. That's not the issue. The question is, do you want to bomb Russia itself? Do you want to cross a line that would allow the Russians to then say, well, you've crossed a line, we're moving into Estonia? Do you want to do that? I think we have to be prepared for them to do that sort of thing, because God knows what Mr. Putin's going to do. I don't know if anybody read carefully his declaration of military operations, but he also talked about rolling NATO protections back from the Baltic states and from all the countries that have been added since 1997. And as you say, we should pay attention to what he says, because he means what he says. And he wants NATO out of the Baltics, and he also wants to incorporate them into some kind of Russian sphere. Whether they're to be incorporated into Russia itself or into a sort of subject satraps is a question only he can answer. But I think we should push it as far as we can without crossing that red line.
Can I say, Karen, too, I don't know if you want to follow up on that, but you don't have to go back to my Ukraine politics question. I think it's an important part, I think, for rounding out the difficulties of getting the political cohesion together right now internally and then afterwards. But is there anything else you want to add to what Dr. Miner was saying?
Well, I guess I would say a couple of things. I mean, and also to sort of start the question that's in the chat. NATO expanded in part because the countries that had been part of the former Eastern Bloc and Soviet Union wanted to be part of NATO. So it comes down to this question of sovereignty, right? Is there going to be sort of sovereignty and self-determination in Europe, or isn't there, right? And so, Russian propaganda can beat the United States and Europe up about the expansion of NATO all at once. But if those countries wanted to join NATO and they had a reason for joining NATO, that seems to me to be something that they had the right to do as sovereign nations, right? So that's my thought about NATO. In terms of the, I'm sorry, I lost the last part of your question. It was about NATO, or was it about
Turkey?
Oh, no, not about Turkey. You asked something else and I lost it. Sorry. I'll just say a little bit about the question, the earlier question. When it seems to me that the participation of Ukrainians in this war have demonstrated that the Maidan revolution is something that and the actions of Russia thereafter since 2014 have solidified a Ukrainian consciousness. And it's as you were saying before, it is an interethnic Ukrainian consciousness, right? You can be Ukrainian and Jewish, Ukrainian and Russian, Ukrainian and Ukrainian, right? Whatever, right? Ukrainian and Tatar. And I think that is a political change that sort of started with Maidan, but also started with the Russian reaction against Maidan. It solidified what had already been burgeoning, right? And I think that's a very important thing that in some ways Russia has created the thing it doesn't want.
Exactly.
That's actually also happening in the diaspora. There's lots of my kids, they are quarter Ukrainian at this point, but they're they're very culturally aware they're Ukrainian, but man, in these last 4 weeks, they are so Ukrainian. They are just, that's all they talk about. And there's people of my generation who grew up speaking Ukrainian, living in Ukrainian enclaves in the northern cities and whatnot, who are suddenly re-embracing their identity. There's even an American actress, Mila Kunis, who I saw an interview with. She actually kind of downplayed her Ukrainian roots and really said earlier she didn't have any connection to it. And now she is like, she and her husband are on TV all over the place, like identifying with Ukraine. So yeah, this identity as a Ukrainian, it's also happening in the diaspora, which is of course much less important than what's happening in Ukraine itself. But that is a phenomenon right now. Everybody's Ukrainian, and the people who are genetically Ukrainian are especially, I think, just very, very vocal about it. My kids are all wearing like some form of Ukraine shirts with various tastes, kind of the whole range of from appropriate to slightly inappropriate. But yeah, very, very, the Ukrainian identity is definitely a thing right now.
And I'd love to get to Boniface's question about this book, Not 1 Inch, which brings up a point that is a little bit more complex. It has to do with this history in the post-'89 world, especially the few years afterwards, where the US and Russia, through Germany, also was trying to negotiate how we were going to respect or whether or not we would incorporate more NATO countries that were part of the former Soviet Union or Warsaw Pact countries.
You're asking about the pledge not to move 1 inch to the east?
Yeah, right.
It's a comment by Baker. The best, I think, dissection of that was done by William Taubman in his biography of Gorbachev, where he does look at it. And Gorbachev actually says he did not feel that this was a pledge not to move NATO to the east. At that point, he said it. Gorbachev, as is often the case, tells several different stories. But he actually did not see it as a pledge not to have anything further east when Eastern Europe collapsed, because nobody foresaw all of what would happen. Also, it wasn't enshrined in any treaty. And if you're going to hold as law something that a foreign minister says, or in this case, a Secretary of State, then you don't have much by way of international order. There was no treaty that said that US forces and NATO would not be moved to the east. It doesn't exist. It's all hinged on a comment as Germany started to fall down around the Soviet years. And I think it's quite a stretch to say that that was a pledge or a binding pledge. And remember, of course, there are binding pledges, right? Such as the agreement in Budapest in 1994, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for recognition of its frontiers by the Russian state. If we're going to ask who's been violating treaties where they actually put their name on the treaty, then I think we should at least discuss that one. I don't think we'd be here, and I don't think we'd be talking about like this if Ukraine had retained its nuclear weapons.
I'd love to go into that. That Budapest agreement is so important because why would Ukraine otherwise give up its nuclear weapons if it didn't trust that it was going to have the guarantee of security?
Exactly.
And to point out in Putin's speech too, he actually literally says, "It is well known that for 30 years, we have persistently and patiently tried to reach an agreement with the leading NATO countries on the principles of equal and indivisible security in Europe. In response to our proposals, we constantly faced either cynical deception and lies or attempts to pressure and blackmail, while the North Atlantic Alliance, in the meantime, despite all our protests and concerns, is steadily expanding." And so they can take that 1 inch idea and make it as if it's concrete, as if they've been just shouting into the woods and nobody's been paying attention as we've been marching towards them.
Well, I also would point out that the NATO argument is, as I said, Putin has several different arguments that he advanced when he made his declaration of war. One of them was NATO, one of them was social issues, one of them was the American history of misbehavior, but one of them was also the EU. We haven't talked about that yet at all, but this is the anniversary of the incorporation of Crimea into Russia, and that came about as a result of the Maidan issue, which was not about NATO expansion. It was about joining the EU. and having closer ties with the EU. It's been my contention, I firmly believe this, that NATO is not the threat that Putin fears the most. What he fears the most is a prosperous and well-integrated Ukraine that works democratically and is part of a West European network. Because if it does succeed, what is the excuse for Putin ruling like a tyrant in Russia? With a long, porous border of people going back and forth and a great deal of interchange. If Ukraine succeeds and has a multinational democracy and is integrated into the West, what world does that leave for Mr. Putin? And I think we have to remember that in 2014, that was the sticking point, not NATO. And we also have comments from retired Russian generals saying, we don't regard NATO as a threat. It might be sometime in the future, but not at present, because as NATO expanded, what happened to the military budgets in all of the NATO nations? They also declined. And American troops went from 300,000 troops in Europe to under 60,000 and no battle tanks. This is not a force that was preparing to attack Russia. And to say that is simply, it's a smokescreen for what the real concern was. And the real concern, and I've always felt this with Mr. Putin, is he shakes to the center of his core from remembering 1989 when he was in Dresden and saw the whole mess fall down around his ears. And then he saw the same thing happen in the Soviet Union, and he saw it happen a couple times in Georgia and in Ukraine. He doesn't want that to happen in Russia. He doesn't want to end life hanging from a lamppost outside the Kremlin. And I think that's what he's really concerned about, is if the people come for him. He can't cooperate with the United States, because if the people come for him, do you think the United States would be on his side? No matter how nice we were, how close we were, Americans would not do that. They'd cut him off.
Such an essential point, too. Does anybody want to comment about how Yanukovych had actually gone back on his word to join the EU and then visits Russia, comes back, and then signs an agreement with China and Russia instead?
Russia can't say at the same time that it favors national sovereignty and at the same time define its own security and its own security interests in being the absolute insecurity of all its neighbors. It can't have it both ways. And this is a point you made, Karen. If there is national sovereignty, the national sovereignty means being able to choose your alliances. People will say, well, Americans wouldn't want Russians in Canada. That's probably quite true, but you also have to ask yourself, why do the Canadians not want the Russians in Canada? There's a reason why Ukraine feels threatened by Russia, and it's history. It's the history of the way Russia behaved in Ukraine, the history of the way Russia behaved in the Baltic states. And Russia is by far not the only victim of history. These countries were victims of Russian mistreatment. And I'd point out that the fighting is in a non-NATO country. It's not in the NATO countries yet.
I have a question to either of you. What use is United Nations right now?
It is a forum where people can talk even when they're not talking elsewhere. In terms of actually doing anything to solve the crisis like this, it's very rarely been of use. But it is actually a forum where you can pass information back and forth. And I think that's useful at a point when more traditional means of passing information have broken down. But it's an expensive way of doing it. But if you expect the UN to act as a world government, then, I mean, where have you been for the last 60 years? It doesn't work like that and never has.
They have peacekeeping function, don't they?
They do, with the approval of all of the Security Council members. Do you think Russia and China will agree to that? They have peacekeeping. Note where the peacekeeping's been. It's been in places like Somalia. It's not been in places that involve great power interests. So, as long as you have a Security Council with a couple members on it that will veto anything, you can't expect any action. They took a vote, and the vote did show that Russia does not enjoy very much support throughout the world. I mean, if all you can do is get India and China to abstain, that's not exactly a vote of hearty support. And we haven't talked about this yet, but Mr. Xi today talked to Biden on the phone. And before the phone call was done, he had his people leak out that they were not pleased with what was happening in Ukraine, and there should be an immediate peace. Now, whether he means that or not, there's an awful lot of lying that goes on, but that he should do this right when the phone call is leak it before the phone call's over, suggests that he did not like what happened, and maybe the Chinese gave a green light to a quick invasion, but this was not a quick and clean invasion, and I don't think their interests are served by a long slog. And at that point, Mr. Lavrov was crowing yesterday, we've turned away from the West. We're turning to the East now. We have allies in the East. Well, maybe they just don't, because the Chinese are not stupid, and I don't think they want to get involved in a mess like this. And they have interests that tie them with the West as well as separate them from the West. But this is not looking good.
We have a question in chat. I think Chris mentioned it before. It refers to the book, No One Inch Eastward, arguing
Yes.
that the war could have been prevented decades ago. Can anyone comment on this, please? Does anyone know the book?
I've heard the name, but it would be wrong to comment on a book I've not read.
Another question, are the Chinese having second thoughts, aware of what will happen if they do not turn from Putin or attack Taiwan?
Right.
Yeah.
My sense, there we go, I'm unmuted now. My sense is that, China is very aware of its economic ties with the rest of the world that it has tried so very valiantly to build up over these last, couple of decades. And the idea of the sanctions and the way that they've hit Russia, and also the kind of general disorder, it seems to me, has made China think twice. I don't know that they'll necessarily turn away from Russia, but I think they are a little bit more aware of what might happen if they did attack Taiwan, right? I mean, I think that this has put an economic line in the sand. The United States and the rest of the world might not, send as many military forces as fast as Taiwan would want, but it would, the fact that it would cut China out of the world market is definitely something that China is paying attention to. So I think that is definitely an aspect of this that's important. And could they put pressure on Russia to withdraw or to come to some kind of face-saving diplomatic solution? I sincerely hope so, because I do think that if it's in China's best interest to do that, they would, that might be something they'd be willing to do. I mean, you asked about Turkey earlier, but China's the other player that might have some influence on Russia and on the situation that could potentially deflect the East-West dichotomy.
Some figures are important to mention here. The trade between Russia and China, which is, for Russia's part, virtually entirely commodities, is just under 100 billion per year. The trade with the United States is over 800 billion per year, and the trade with EU is a little bit bigger than that. So you have a 15-to-1 advantage in terms of trade. Now, trade doesn't determine everything, and I know that the Chinese are restive about the dollar and they don't like the Taiwan situation. But in the Chinese mind, they draw a very sharp distinction between Ukraine, which they recognize as a separate country, and with which they have relations, and Taiwan, which they regard as part of China. And so they don't regard it as an international issue, and they don't see a parallel between the two. But what they do not want to see, it seems to me, Timothy Garton Ash made this in a point in an article today. What they do not want to see is the United States and Europe driven together. And Mr. Putin is doing exactly that. And if there seem to be too much in Mr. Putin's camp, the kind of sanctions that are applied to Mr. Putin could be extended to portions of the Chinese economy. And Mr. Xi has fallen all over himself in the last few days to say, we want trade, we want order, we want legality, and we want national sovereignty. He keeps saying this over and over again. And national sovereignty is a signal that means not Taiwan, because that's not a nation, but Ukraine is. And so I think they're very displeased with what's going on. And I don't think they've given a blank check to Russia by any means.
There's another concern argument I heard recently that China has very large border with Russia, not with the United States. And the last thing Chinese need is strong militarized Russia.
Right. And that border is still, although they've come to an agreement, the border is still in dispute in the far eastern portion. The Chinese regard that as a product of what they call unequal treaties. And so, you know, one of my old advisors once said, anybody who says that there's long-term cooperation between China and Russia doesn't know anything about history. There are an awful lot of flashpoints, Central Asia being one of them.
Anara, would you like to say something about Central Asia and China?
I just would like to say, in all the situation, regardless the result, China is a winner. So yes. China has will have a weak Russia, will dominate and have better access to all resources in Central Asia, in Siberia. So I think that what actually is a result of war, at the end we will have a stronger China, and we don't know what to expect from China, and China learning lessons very quickly, and I'm afraid the next conflict might be already with China somewhere in Southeast Asia. So that's why I think that it's a message that everything should be reconsidered, because we just realized that we relaxed, we lived in post-war order, and post-war order is over. And regarding the Soviet Union, actually, I am listening actually and watching the Russian analysts, how they actually assess the situation. And some of them say, actually, what we can see right now, it's the agony of Soviet Union. In our textbook says that Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. It's not true. It just was pre-collapse. And right now we can see the real agony of the Soviet Union. And Soviet Union, as a modern Russia, wanted to restore again that the previous Soviet Union, number one, I say. And that's why we can see it's a very painful experiment. And what we can see in Ukraine, it's a birth of democracy. It's a very painful process. Both processes are very, very painful. The death of Soviet Union and the birth of a new democratic state of actually country. And I would see even this and wider, actually, I would like to see a wider picture that, as I mentioned before, actually what we can see, the main fear of Putin and of course his supporters is the color revolution. He was obsessed with the color revolutions. And we can see that the first target was Georgia, then Ukraine. It was very easy to change situation in Kyrgyzstan. So that's why we can see that actually there was a fear that next color revolution might be in Russia. So that's why I think that Putin is fighting, as Professor Meyer well actually emphasized, that the main fear was actually that Russia may face more challenges inside rather than outside.
He also went to the rescue of Kazakhstan a few weeks ago, and last summer to Belarus. So he's acting as the fireman for this Ruski Mir, for this Russian world that he foresees. And he's also he's in a sense, he's a throwback to Nicholas I and the doctrine of legitimacy, that only legitimate change comes from the top, not from the bottom. And he's made this case in Syria and in Libya as well, that these were, you may not like Assad, but it was a legitimate state recognized by the UN. And here come these forces, these rebel forces that want to overthrow him with complete illegitimacy. We don't care what Assad does to his people. He's a legitimate government, and we're defending legitimacy. And so I think he's come up with a kind of quasi-historical argument that is rooted to some degree in Russian history. And he wants to see like-minded authoritarian states with a sort of legitimist ethos as a belt around Russia. But in order to do that, he has to deny them any kind of real national sovereignty.
I wanted to ask you both, what do you think will happen to Russia after the war? Because I think we more or less know what will happen after the war when Ukraine wins, about which I have no personal doubt. But many analysts agree that what will happen in Russia will not be pretty and will remind us the beginning of 17th century, which we call Smutное время, or time of troubles, after Ivan the Terrible died trying to conquer the same parts of Eastern Europe in a war. There was very bad time for Russian history, which probably generated a lot of future events. So since we never seen a country that fast cut off by sanctions, a country that big and that relying on the West, it's not North Korea. North Korea is collapsing for 50, 60 years on itself. They're small, but Russia probably is not sustainable. So I heard many predictions that predict Yugoslavian scenario or Somalian scenario or combination of such.
I think you're right. I think that's the real worry, that Russia is Putin threw all the dice on hoping that this could show that Russia was a great power, that it remained in the great power club, and he was going to show Mr. Xi, but also the West, that Russia was a force to be reckoned with. Well, he threw the dice, and they didn't come up in his favor, and there's not a lot behind the facade. And as you say, there's all sorts of internal centrifugal forces that can come into play if the center is weakened. There's separatism within Russia itself. Russia's a multinational empire, and you could suddenly see secessionist movements. There was even talk with the Taliban that they would move into the southern portions of Central Asia if Russia is weakened. So you could see frontier wars. I know that's not in Russia, but it's in what certainly Putin regards as the Russian sphere. You could see all sorts of violence, and as you say, the time of troubles. Let's not forget, it led to the death of about a third of the population. And you could see something like that happening, but at that point, it would draw in everybody. And I'm certain that China would be drawn in. I think Anara's comment about China being the ultimate winner is absolutely spot on. No matter whether Russia wins or loses, and I don't think Russia's going to win in any recognizable way, a very weakened and very dependent Russia is exactly what China wants. And you can go back in Chinese history and say, this is what they did with the barbarians to the north. As long as they were defanged and dependent, they were okay. And it fits into a Chinese historical pattern. So you're right. I think who can tell? Who can tell? It's at that point you can think of a million different possible scenarios.
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
yeah.
one of the key questions is, what are the political alternatives within Russia, sort of besides Putin, right? I mean, I think that's are there people around, people in the upper leadership who are, I don't know, Putin light, or who, sort of would be able to produce a better, sort of, it from an internal overthrow, or is it really, going to be every person for himself, right? That's every man for himself kind of fraternal violence. That's really a scary thought.
If you're going to use the time of troubles as your template, then what is going to happen probably is immense violence followed by an exhaustion and a Zemsky Sobor to elect a new leader, some kind of national council that would come together and say enough is enough, a sort of peace of Westphalia, but within Russia itself. But it's never happened in a nuclear state. I don't mean to add on, but at no point has that kind of anarchy existed in a nuclear state, and so we're in unknown waters, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Chris?
Well, I think there are some very interesting points that have been made here, a lot of important perspective too. The kind of international context, the broader international context has been discussed as well. People like Michael Beckley, John Mearsheimer have talked about how China is really much more of a rival of ours than Russia, even in terms of obviously the size of the population, their their economic output, their military as well, and kind of what their interests are too. And even Mearsheimer recently even said that he thought we should pivot towards Russia against China. So obviously he's talking about the great power politics aspect, where it's very just kind of cold-blooded, not in terms of cold-blooded that we don't care about people, but he points out some important parts of international history and the reality, which is that we have to deal with the world that we have right now. And so how do we, because this situation with Russia right now, from his perspective, is very concerning, because we're focusing entirely on Russia and Ukraine, but this could be also an opportunity for China to be increasing its power, and they might be able to do something that it'd be difficult for us to thwart, because now we're dealing with Russia.
Well, the one country nobody's mentioned today is India. And Mr. Lavrov mentioned India as being a country they were going to pivot towards. The Indians are ambivalent about this. They've been a long-time arms partner with Russia, but at the same time, they have a lot of strategic interests in common with the United States, and one of those is containing China. And the United States is increasingly hostile to Pakistan, which is only good news to New Delhi, I think. But the position of India is going to be quite interesting. I see that somebody sent in a comment that Trump pivoted towards India. Yeah, but we've pivoted away. And I think that is a big question. And you know, if you're talking in pure American terms, I don't think we can trust Putin enough to ride with him against China. I don't think he's shown himself to be completely untrustworthy. And until there's a change in the Russian government, I don't see how anybody in the West can trust him ever again. India is a perfectly reasonable partner, and they have interests, and many of their interests coincide with those of the Western democracies.
That's really important that you brought up India, of course, because during the Cold War in particular, we were more on Pakistan's side. We're trying to balance between Pakistan and India. And this is tied in with our problems in Afghanistan as well, because Pakistan has needed to support the Taliban to prevent pro-India factions within Afghanistan. And so that India-Pakistan split that we've been dealing with for, 80 years now, or 75 years now, isn't going to go away. And that's always going to be a factor in geopolitics in the region.
Right.
Returning to immediate situation, Ukraine, we're almost for 2 hours now here, and thank you all for a great conversation. But I wanted to ask one question. Since NATO seems to be very wavering, what should we expect in terms of what Zelensky says about individual agreements with United Kingdom, with Poland? Can NATO countries, by NATO Charter, act on their own?
Yes, they can. There's this 15-point program that's being kicked around. I don't know if any of you have heard this, but the discussions between Ukraine and Russia, a 15-point peace outline has been kicked around, and one of the points is that Ukraine would pledge not to join NATO, but it would be free to have bilateral defense treaties with countries it chose to have treaties with, and I think that's what you're talking about here. And I think these countries can, of course, we have treaties with countries that are not NATO countries. You can do that. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. Would the United States be a good strategic partner for Ukraine? I don't know. Certainly Britain would be willing, I think. Britain is incredibly hawkish on Ukraine and has taken a real lead in training and equipping Ukrainian forces. So I think that may be a way around the barn, if you will, to getting into NATO without calling it NATO. Because a Russia that doesn't succeed in Ukraine, and I hope you're absolutely right that it won't, Russia's going to be somewhat chastened about dealing with Ukraine, and Ukraine will rush to get defensive treaties. And at that point, it won't be as vulnerable.
I hate to throw another monkey wrench into this, but Stefan, would you like to comment about Germany's position?
I mean, maybe not necessarily Germany, but if you're thinking about great powers, Europe is sort of solidifying into a military power here very slowly. And that was something that just a year ago, most people in Europe would have opposed. The unified European constitution sort of famously died a slow death, mostly around the question of a single European defense force. And now every single country, including Germany, is rearming at an incredible rate. Germany has just passed, or is in the process of passing, a defense budget that is twice the total amount of its normal defense budget, sort of a special defense budget. And that's not aid that's going specifically to the Ukraine. That's sort of a fundamental rebuilding of the German military into sort of a potential international military force that it can't really legally be, but is becoming now, right? And that is happening in a lot of countries. I think a real potential danger for this is how countries like Poland react when Russian forces are inching closer and closer on Ukrainian territory. There's been growing unrest in Poland. They've had sort of right-wing paramilitary forces training in that country for a long time, all under the sort of auspices of a potential Russian invasion. So that could very well be some sort of border crossing coming from there, right? So if you're thinking about sort of a unified West, part of the outcome might be that the West isn't as unified anymore because Europe is sort of emerging as a military power, which is an odd thing to say, and it's not something I would have said a year ago or a month ago, maybe. It's a really odd, hasty development to a degree where a lot of people in Europe are debating it. It's sort of in a very befuddled way, seeing it happen, but not quite knowing what to make of that. And that's something to keep an eye on. It's certainly strengthening internal cohesion in the EU immensely. Internal cohesion was pretty poor, especially after the last round of eastward expansion of the EU. A lot of conservative politicians in Europe opposed that sort of retroactively, including the conservative politicians that are now calling for opening conversations with Ukraine to join the EU. Again, not something I would have expected to see happen a few weeks ago. It's really sort of changing at a breakneck speed in Europe here as well.
I did not expect to live long enough to see Sweden and Finland actually serious about joining NATO.
Yeah.
Who did?
Or Switzerland allowing taking a side in a banking issue.
And yet there are strains. You mentioned Hungary and Poland. Of course, they just had sanctions slapped on them by the EU over this whole judiciary question. And it's peculiar, and I've not seen this discussed very much, and it should be discussed in the press, but what are the implications of doing this to two countries that are, if you will, frontline states and are accepting literally millions of refugees? I'd like to know more about that. It seems to have gone, I only found out about this when a friend commented about it to me, and I had to do about an hour's worth of search before I found any articles that dealt with it. It's not covered in the mainstream press, and I don't know why. This strikes me as actually a rather big issue. It's a potential weak point in what, as you say, is an emerging stronger front of Europe.
And it's really fascinating because a lot of the European laws were not written with Eastern European countries in mind. Right. And a lot of sort of the backlash against the eastward expansion EU internally, especially in France, Germany, and Italy, has been that feeling that, oh, right, somebody like Poland can now be significantly in charge of European Union policy in a way where there's no sort of controls on that. So there could be a eastward shift of internal power of the EU, and somebody like Poland could really take charge. And there's right,
but I've also
with
seen
the
the
sort
Russians
of press
pick up on
question. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I thought you had paused. Please, I interrupted.
Oh no, I'm just saying that there's good parts and bad parts to that, right? The sort of encroachment on the free press in Poland or Hungary, right, is the negative illustration of that. That there's really no really effective internal sanctioning going on in the European Union because there's no mechanisms to really do that. At the same time, there could be a positive outcome of that, right? Where sort of the eastern part of Europe really becomes sort of the political center here in the next couple of years. I could really see that happening.
The Russians have picked up on this, though, these sanctions being slapped on Hungary and Poland, and they've funneled it into this argument about the licentious West, because they say, what is the issue that's at stake here? Oh, it's the judiciary. And what laws are at stake? Oh, it's laws about LGBT issues. This is part of the Moloch of the EU that's pushing this Western gender-free lifestyle on the East. And so they've used it as yet another brick to throw at the West and say, see, this is the so-called civilization that you're pushing eastward.
Great points all around. Before we close up, I wanted to also throw something out there that we are approaching the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I've seen comparisons between this action and that one, although there's a tremendous amount of differences too. We could bring in the Berlin airlift and various concerns over Checkpoint Charlie during the Cold War. But this actually does kind of tie in with the book that Boniface mentioned too. The author, Emmy Surratt, wrote an article recently about how the title is something like, "I'm a Cold War historian and I'm worried." So she's pointing out how during the Cold War, there was kind of an understanding between us and the Soviets, the patrolling, for example, in the skies, that we understood we didn't want to cross over into Russian territory. They didn't want to cross over into ours. The pilots would in fact meet in the air and just kind of buzz each other's noses, and then they go back. There was this routine, and because we always wanted to avoid war. And it seems like this is what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis as well, that once we established a back channel with Khrushchev, then we were able to come to an agreement. We had an agreement that we would pull the missiles out of Europe and then, or Turkey and Italy, and he would pull missiles out of Cuba as long as he didn't admit that that's what we were doing. But with this situation, we don't have that same kind of a modus vivendi that's established, that he has changed the rules, and we don't have the same kind of back channel. Does anybody want to comment on the comparisons?
I'd make one point. I miss the generation that experienced war and the Second World War and understood what a war meant. And the people who were in charge in the 1960s, it may have been a dangerous period, and it certainly was. But they'd been through the Second World War and they knew what war meant. And they didn't throw around nuclear talk with such carefree abandon as people are doing these days. And a war in Europe, a genuine war in Europe that drew in all of the powers, would be ruination like nothing the world's ever seen before. And I don't think there's a sense with Putin of just how destructive that war would be. I think he has a sort of idealized version of the Second World War, sanitized version of the war in his mind. I think his predecessors in the Soviet Union, they weren't lovely guys, but they'd all been at the front and they saw what war did. And I don't think they wanted to revisit that. And I don't think the Americans who experienced the war wanted to revisit it either. And I don't know that there's that sobriety at the top anymore.
Yeah, it also speaks about an off-ramp, right? I mean, Putin has gotten into this terrible situation, and, one option is that there will be no, the Putin government will fall in some way, and that will solve the problem in some sense. But if Putin is in power, there has to be a way to end the war that will, that will allow him some kind of ability to say, oh, okay, I'm walking away because I got something. Right. And so I think that's something with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev wasn't allowed to say what he got, but he did indeed get something. And here, I don't know how are we going to construct this diplomacy that for Putin to walk away claiming something that he obviously needs to claim publicly, while actually being fair to Ukraine, who is an innocent party in this, whose land was invaded, and you can't, are we going to chop off a piece of Ukraine? Okay, here, have a little bit of Ukraine. I mean, we can't do that, right? So how do you end up with a face-saving off-ramp? I don't see one.
Well, we can always count on him to lie, and that's certainly one thing he can do. And he could certainly claim, I've got the sanctions removed. They've been sanctioning us for years and years and years, but we showed Ukraine that we were serious. They'll certainly hang on to Crimea. I can't see that going back in our lifetimes. And say, see, we restored Russia's dignity, and we got the sanctions removed, and bully for us. And that's what he'll say to his own people. It certainly will be a humiliating withdrawal, but I guess I'm not all that concerned about how humiliated he is.
Does anybody else want to say something?
We have a lot of guests. Maybe before we finish, they want to ask something by chat, please.
Yes, anyone who didn't get a chance to ask something, please do so, or you can turn your mic on and say it. Okay.
One thing I'm concerned about, and Victor, I think I'm with you that the Ukrainians can't be beaten easily, but Mr. Putin has rarely found a weapon system he wasn't willing to use. And I'm afraid that he's going to use some awfully horrible stuff in Ukraine before this gets to a point where a deal is finally written. And he's brought in these thermobaric bombs that are just short of nuclear weapons in their destructive capacity. I don't think he'd hesitate to use them in Kiev if he thought it would advance an inch towards his interests.
I thought about one of the comparisons, because I know if we bring up Syria and we bring up Grozny and we bring up Georgia, other places as well in the past, then we can see that the destructive capacity of the Russian military and his willingness to level cities is quite high. He clearly has no concern for strategic bombing. It's mostly about trying to terrorize the population into submission, and so maybe the difference in the case of Ukraine is that they can't station everything in that country like they've been able to do in those other places. In Syria, they were welcomed in, and in the case of Chechnya, it's a small place, as with Georgia too. So I wonder if his bombing capacity will be the same. Do you think anything about that? Because he actually can't occupy it and be undeterred.
But you don't have to occupy all of it to be able to shell it. That's the problem. You don't even have to control the skies. This is why I think the issue of whether or not Russian planes are able to use the skies is an important one, but it isn't the only one. And all of Kiev is now within artillery range, as is Kharkiv, as are other Ukrainian cities. And he has destroyed at least two cities in the past, Aleppo and Grozny. And I'm not sure he sees any moral difference between those cities and Kiev.
Well, one of the differences is his alleged role as the defender of Orthodox Christianity.
There is that.
Which was not true for Aleppo or Grozny. And in this, as we finish, I wonder what is the change in, whether there is a change in position of Russian Orthodox Church, as opposed, of course, to Ukrainian one. Have anyone heard?
There are some encouraging elements. So the patriarch is definitely in Putin's hands, and he's come out and said that this is basically a holy war. But there are 233 clerics who have signed a letter saying that the people who prosecute this war and continue to do so imperil their immortal souls and will burn in a lake of fire. They actually use these words. And that's very unusual in the Orthodox world for clerics to openly dissent from the hierarchs in the church and from the state even. And so it's a sign that the house isn't in order. And that's a very, very promising sign, I think.
I'm saying this because Putin and his government have been using Orthodoxy in very unorthodox way, so to say. And people in this country, religious people, have been asking me over the years, how can Putin be so bad since he is the devout Christian? It's very hard to distinguish sham patriarchs from and sham Christians from what he really is. But I hope more clerics see the light right now, especially in foreign Russian church, which has been under Moscow, as you know, since recently.
I actually wrote a book on Stalin and the Russian Orthodox Church during the war, and there is a parallel to that. He brought the patriarch back in 1943, and a lot of people in the West said, "Oh, this is the great reconciliation we've been waiting for." And he used the Orthodox Church as a means of reestablishing Soviet control over the Western borderlands. So Putin is taking a page out of Stalin's playbook in this, and it's always hard to tell. Well, has there been a change of heart at the top? Putin was a KGB man, and the KGB was officially atheist, and there's no reason to think he was any different. But as you say, he's been courting the Russian church as a lover for the last 20 years. And is it genuine? I rather doubt it.
A woman was arrested 2 days ago in Moscow in front of the Christ the Savior Cathedral for holding a poster with words, "Thou shalt not kill." I don't think this happened much elsewhere so far since Middle Ages.
Well, that's a great place to stop, I should say. And it is actually a start too, because we're going to have these continuing every Friday about this time. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for an incredibly knowledgeable and insightful discussion, giving us a lot to think about. Dr. Stephen Miner of Ohio University, Dr. Karen Patron from University of Kentucky. Thank you so much for standing with us as we're talking about this, and I appreciate the interviews that you gave me as well. It gave me a lot to think about. I'm just here to learn from you all, and I hope we can just keep perpetuating this message. Dr. Katerina Shrey, Dr. Anara Tabashlieva, Dr. Stefan Schoberlane, and everybody else. Thank you so much, Larry Sherritt, for hosting this as well. For organizing this, and Marshall Libraries. And of course, we want to put a plug out there for Ukraine through which we'll include in the notes too. This is a depository for information on Ukraine. And there's anything else anybody wanted to add, then this would be the time to do it.
I'd like to thank everybody, and it was a delight meeting you all. To see faces.
Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure to speak with all of you and meet you.
Thank you very much.
You.
And thanks for technology.
Very much.
Technology which allows us to do so.
Yes, definitely. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.